Welcome to the Relational Grace Podcast, where we share the teachings of Pastor Nick Harris, who taught us that Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship. I'm your host, Jamie Russell, Pastor Harris's son. The events of 1 Samuel chapter 26 and 1 Samuel chapter 24 look very similar, if not identical, but in fact they are remarkably different. Where they are similar in both instances, Saul, the king of Israel, is pursuing David. Saul fails, and God delivers him into the hands of David, who chooses to do nothing about it and to release him because he is the king, and he is God's anointed. In fact, in the second instance, David's men come alongside him and say that they've got to do something. They've been running from him, and they felt they needed to kill him. David still stays committed to what he knows to be true. The thing that is interesting and pretty bad for Saul, given these two instances, God had revealed that he had withdrawn his protection from Saul. He had been given over to the hands of David now twice. This could not make it more clear to Saul. David realizes that this cat-and-mouse game could not last forever. It was wearing out his men, and they wanted to kill Saul, and that was wearing David out. David previously had fled from Saul by going to the land of the Philistines, and now had to face that terrible idea of doing it again, leaving the promised land. So he decided to go to the land of Gath and place his warriors at the disposal of King Achish. This king, however, did not like the idea of having someone so powerful in his midst, so he placed David in a town called Ziklag. And this will be the setting for Pastor Harris's message today. So let's hear Pastor Harris tell us more about what David is up to in the 6th episode of the Saga of David series titled The Days of Ziklag.
When I was a teenager, about 3,000 years ago, one of my closest friends, a kid named Ronnie Alexander, lived directly across the street from me. And one Saturday morning I think it was 7 o'clock in the morning, it's very early, we'd just finished breakfast at our house when there was a knock on the front door. And my mother went to the door, and there stood Ronnie. He asked my mom if I was home, and Mom yelled into the kitchen. I was eating pancakes, and I was always the last one to get through eating. And Mom yelled in the kitchen and said, "Nick, it's for you." Well, just as soon as I got to the door, Ronnie pointed across the street, and sitting there in his father's driveway was an old World War II vintage Army Jeep. He looked at me and says, "What do you think of her?" And I said, "Man, that's great. Whose is it?" And Ronnie said, "It's mine." And he said, "It's got four-wheel drive, Nick. I mean, four-wheel drive. Let's go see what it'll do." So I forgot my pancakes. I raced out the door, ran across the street, jumped into the Jeep, and we took off to find the deepest mud hole in all of the free state of Van Zandt. And why not? The Jeep had four-wheel drive. I mean, that's the key here. Well, we found a really good mud hole, and Ronnie immediately drove right out in the very middle of it. What a gas. All four wheels turning. We were spraying mud everywhere. I'd never had such a time. But guess what? You guessed it. I heard somebody say it. We immediately sank right up to the running boards of that Jeep. All four wheels continued to spin, but we went nowhere. We were slinging mud high in the air, but all the time we just kept sinking deeper and deeper and deeper with each turn of the wheels. I mean, this was looking like a disaster in full bloom. Well, we sat there and we talked about what we ought to do. We're probably there for half an hour until we finally decided that this thing was getting so deep that we might just drown in it. So if we were going to get out alive, we were going to have to get out of the Jeep and wade out of the bog. And that's exactly what the two of us attempted to do. I piled out on my side, he piled out on his, and immediately we sunk right up almost to our hips in mud. We were in so deep that we couldn't pull our feet out. We were as stuck as the Jeep was. So here we were in this muddy, boggy hole, which was a veritable bottomless pit. We couldn't get ourselves out, and the harder we tried, the deeper we sank. What a mess. We were just two dumb kids that didn't have a brain between the two of us, hopelessly stuck in the mud. Well, thank God a farmer came by, driving a red Farmall tractor. The first thing he did was throw us a rope, and he pulled the two of us out one at a time. Then he hooked on a chain, and he pulled the Jeep out. I've never forgotten that. I think of standing there covered in mud, from the top of my head to the bottom of my feet, feeling stupid, and that farmer looking at both of us going. Well, David ben Jesse, our hero, had a similar problem to that which Ronnie and I had when we were stuck in the mud hole. He too found himself in a kind of muddy bog, and he found that he couldn't get himself out either. And David found himself in that precarious position for one reason. It was the result of what I call stinking thinking, and then David complicates his stinking thinking with some stupid acting. Now, David's mess is described for us in 1 Samuel chapter 27, verse 1. Now, listen to these words. And David said in his heart. Now, that's important. David said in his heart, now I shall perish someday by the hand of Saul. There's nothing better for me than I should speedily escape to the land of the Philistines. Now, do you see what the text says here? Look at it again. Put it back up, Fred. It says, and David said in his heart. David said in his heart. Now, let me share a little secret that I've discovered over the years. Can I do that? If you and I are going to allow ourselves to develop the habit of listening to ourselves speak, we better have some good things to say to ourselves, right? If you don't have anything good to say and you're talking, shut up. Listen, I'm an expert at this. I talk to myself a lot, and I have had some things to say to myself that weren't fit for a dog to hear. I can remember the day in December of 1981 when God sent Chris and me to First United Methodist Church in Oklahoma City. Never forget it. We had to wait a month, and actually it was longer than a month. It was about a month and 15 days to take the pulpit there. So we go in on that Sunday morning to this old church. I mean, built in 1904. Everything about that church looked old. We walked in, and what I saw terrified me. I took one look at that congregation, and I said, this church can't make it for another year. I'm talking to myself. Get it? I'm giving myself input. I'm saying this church can't make it for another year. The people look so old. They wouldn't look that old to me now. That they look so old. The average age of the members of that church was over 72. I said to myself, there's never going to be a thriving church on this corner. It's an impossibility. This church is too far gone. Now, if you haven't guessed already, this was doubt and unbelief revealing itself. I was thinking it. I thought I was safe because I wasn't saying it. Hey, sometimes it's as bad to think it as it is to say it. I said, look, this is not so bad. I'm only saying it to myself. In fact, I convinced myself that nobody else but me knew I was thinking such thoughts. But that didn't matter. The damage was being done, you see. What I was doing was this. I was painting my life into a corner by feeding myself on thoughts reflecting doubt and unbelief. And David was doing the same thing. He had gotten so bogged down in negativity that it didn't matter to him what people of faith were saying all around him. Remember, many years earlier, the godly prophet Samuel had said to him, David, listen to me. I'm anointing you to be king, and you're going to be king. That's what godly Samuel said. The godly Abigail, whom he married, had said to him, you're going to sit on the throne, David. I'm telling you, I know you're going to be king. The godly Jonathan had said to him, you are the next in line to be king. Even King Saul himself, that poor pitiful thing, had said, now I know I'm looking at my successor. Everyone was sure of David's future except one person, David himself. And David wasn't sure that he had a future any longer. Oh, sure. When he talked to others, he had good things to say. He looked and sounded good on the outside. And because he looked and sounded good, people eagerly followed him. Externally, he seemed to be positive, energetic, outgoing. But internally, the hidden David was terrified. So let's take a long look this morning at the hidden David. Not the public David. Not this act he put on. See, one thing people don't know about me. They see the outer Nick. They don't see the internet. And the internet is really very private. My wife will tell you that. I could spend days alone by myself, doing nothing but studying and writing. That's this me. There is that other me that's out there, that's friendly and gregarious. But the real me is that private person. That's who I am on the inside. And David was like me. That's why I relate to David. I can look at him and see myself in him. And do you know what David was saying when he spoke to himself that day? We know because it's recorded for us. Here's what David was saying. This was his stinking thinking being recorded. He was saying to himself, and I quote, I will perish one day by the hand of Saul. In other words, I'm not going to survive this. I can't make it. I'm going to die. Now, God said you're going to be king. Samuel said you're going to be king. Abigail said you're going to be king. Jonathan said you're going to be king. Saul said you're going to be king. And David said, I'm going to die. I'll never survive. Now, there's not much faith here, is there? There's not much faith here. So what do we do with those inner defeatist attitudes? Do any of you ever have inner defeatist attitudes? What do we do when in our heart of hearts we believe that we have no future? We should turn to God, right? But do we turn to God? The answer is no. Of course not. We don't see God. Instead, what do? We try to manipulate our circumstances in our own strength. And that's what David did. And when he manipulated his circumstances, he began to publicly act out his negative, doubt-generated thought life. Now, we all do that, you know. Beloved, we all allow our minds to dwell on negative things. But let me warn you, when we do this long enough, we eventually act out those negative thoughts. David did. And in the wake of his defeated thought life, he uttered the words that are recorded for us in 1 Samuel 27:1. Let's read them again. And David said in his heart, now I shall perish someday by the hand of Saul. There's nothing better for me than that I should speedily escape to the land of the Philistines. See, that's his decision. He's going to manipulate his circumstances. What's the solution? He's tried it once. It didn't work. What is insanity? It's doing the same thing over and over and over again, expecting a different result. David's going back to the very place that he had left earlier. He's going back to Philistia. His negative view of his future possibilities caused him to pack his bags and go back to Philistia. That was his solution to his dilemma. Well, let me tell you, at first this decision seemed to work beautifully. In fact, it worked like a charm. It looked like he had manipulated himself into the best situation imaginable. There weren't no mud holes in Philistia. Think about it. Saul stopped pursuing. Never again does Saul ever pursue him. The mad king suddenly called off the dogs. David said, whew, am I glad that's over. Right? The text says this, Saul sought no more for him again. Well, you better believe that David let out a sigh of relief. Now, to fully understand the story, we have to understand this. David made the decision to go back to Philistia, but he only planned to stay for a short time. I'm just going to go and rest and recoup. Huh? Sounds like a good plan to me. I mean, this sounds like something Nick would do. You see, he didn't plan when he went to Philistia to adopt a whole new way of life or develop a new way of thinking. But I found that when you drive a Jeep into a bog, you're going to get muddy. Hello? And let me tell you something else. When you settle in the land of Philistia, you'll eventually learn to speak Philistine. Now, you know, the favorite word of the Hebrews was, right? I mean, you all know what that word is. Their very favorite word. They were always saying, wow. See, God was always doing things. They were always going, wow. They never ceased to be amazed at the way in which their God delivered them from their circumstances. But do you know what the favorite word of the Philistines was? The one that they said all the time? Their favorite word was, uh-oh. Their gods, which were no gods at all, could not deliver them from anything. So they never had a wow moment. They only had uh-oh moments. All they could say was, uh-oh. In other words, the Philistines were not people of faith. And their words reflected it. And David chose to make a home in the midst of these doubting people. And before long, David actually began to enjoy Philistia. You know, misery loves company. Hello? Am I the only one who thinks that? Misery loves company. So David came to believe that things weren't as bad here as he once thought. The Philistines weren't so bad. There's just one problem. David didn't belong here. You understand? No matter how comfortable things had become, David did not belong in Philistia. Why? Because he was the anointed king of Israel, and he didn't belong there. He belonged to his people. But that wasn't the worst part. He didn't just live here. He chose to offer himself and his servants the services of his men to the depraved pagan king of Philistia. Listen to 1 Samuel 27:5. Then David said to Achish, now Achish is the king of Philistia, if I have found favor in your eyes, let them give me a place in some town in the country that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you? Beloved, this is stinking thinking run amok. It's disgusting. Listen to me. When God anoints a man to be king, that man is going to be king. God will see to it. And 1,000 King Sauls and 1,000 King Achishes can never stop him. But you know something? David had forgotten that. And so do we. Once again, why did he flee to the enemy camp? He fled because of fear, not faith. Now let me assure you, Philistia was not the place for a future king of Israel. Philistia was a moral and a spiritual mud hole. He had just moved him and his jeep right into the middle of this old muddy bog. And none of us, including David, can live among the stars as God demands when we're up to our waist in a mud hole. I mean, that's just very simply the truth. You can't keep one foot in God's kingdom and one foot in the world. This I can promise you. If you try to do that, if you try to keep one foot in God's kingdom and one foot in the world will win that battle every time. And David proves it. He went to Philistia and he pitched his tent. A temporary dwelling, right? A tent is just a temporary thing. You take it down, you move it somewhere else. But soon he was living in a house there, a permanent dwelling. Now listen to me. David's experience proves something that I've believed for a long time. Sometimes, when we decide to move into the camp of our enemy, I'm talking about the domain of Satan, our enemy will initially bless us. As the Bible says, there's pleasure in sin for a season. You think, I'm not going to live for God, I'm going to go out and live like the world, and you may have the time of your life. I'm not going to deny it. But it's only for a season. David was given an entire town by the Philistines, the town of Ziklag. This place was certainly better than the caves in which he's been living, right? I mean, now he had a home. It was in Philistia, but he had been blessed with a home. There in Philistia, David was being blessed financially by the Philistine king. And now he had security. That security he had been seeking for. Now he had it. Philistia was being great to him. People ask you, how you doing? They've never done better in my life. But while things were good on the outside, something awful was happening to David on the inside. Huh? You with me? Go through the Psalms. I dare you. See if you can find one psalm that was written while he was living in Philistia. I can tell you now, you won't. You won't find it. And there's a reason. You see, we'll never grow spiritually when we're choosing to live in the world. Choosing to live a life of sin. Now, you may be a Christian. You may be going to heaven when you die. But if you've got your feet in the world, you've got your feet in the mud. In fact, when we're in that situation, we'll always find ourselves doing what David did. You see, he ceased to work and to do the work of the Lord. And he began to do the work of the enemy of the people of God. In fact, David eventually allowed himself to become the personal bodyguard of King Achish of Gath. And soon, he and his men, now think about this, were raiding settlements in behalf of this man. Yes, here is the future king of Israel, agreeing to raid villages and kill people in behalf of his new king, a Philistine. So here was a man, anointed of God to be the king of Israel, And he had agreed to do war on behalf of the enemies of the people he would one day rule. Now granted, David would never attack a Hebrew city. But he did convince the Philistines. He did. They would send him out to attack a Hebrew village, and he would come back and they said, "Did you do the job?" And he'd say, "Oh yeah, I did it." He didn't, but he said he did. And that took a whole lot of lying. And soon, after he lied enough, duplicity, deceit, and half-truths became a way of life to David, and that's no way for a future king to live. Now let me ask you this. Have you ever told a lie and then tried to maintain it? Now invariably, that lie will begin to take on a life of its own, and soon you'll be lying about the lie. Hello? In time, you'll not be able to remember what you said the time before. And that's the situation that David found himself in. Now, as Abe Lincoln once said, you can fool some of the people all of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all the time. Well, David fooled King Achish all of the time, but he did not fool some of the commanders of the Philistine army. You see, they just never trusted him. They would look at David and they'd say, I don't know about this guy. So when David went with Achish to fight against Saul and the massed armies of Israel, all of Israel had gathered up in the north at the mouth of the great valley of Jezreel, outside the city of Bethshan, on the mountain that is called Gilboa. There Saul planned to have an end-all with the Philistines. So Achish, loving the way David and his men fought, calls him to go along with him. But the Philistine generals were leery of David. They convinced Achish, said, "Look, we can't have that guy. He may turn on us, and then we'd have the enemy in the rear and the enemy in the front, and we would be in a bad way. Don't bring him with us." So Achish followed the advice of the general staff. He sent David home. It left him in a real dilemma. You see this? In a sense, David had become a man without a country. He was neither an Israelite nor a Philistine. Neither side wanted him. The Israelites didn't want him. The Philistines didn't want him. But this was only the start of his problem. David is sent home. He makes that long trek out of southern Galilee all the way back to Ziklag. But guess what happens when he arrives in Ziklag? Guess what he arrives to? It's recorded to us in 1 Samuel chapter 30, verses 1 through 5. Listen to this. Now it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag, David's town, on the third day, that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag, attacked Ziklag and burned it with fire, and had taken captive the women and those who were there from small to great. They did not kill anyone, but they carried them away and went their way. So David and his men came into the city, and there it was, burned with fire. And their wives, their sons, and their daughters had been taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept, until they had no more power to weep. And David's two wives, Ahinoam, the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite, had been taken captive. What a sad story. Things didn't look so hot in Philistia anymore, did they? Do you see the price for choosing to live with one foot in the kingdom and one foot out of the kingdom? Well, the Amalekites, while David was gone, had descended upon Ziklag and burned the entire town to the ground. Captured all the families of David's mighty men, all of them. And not only that, they had taken, as you saw here, David's two wives, one of which was his beloved Abigail. Now, can you imagine? David's men were royally ticked off. Wouldn't you be? Here's a guy that's supposed to command you. He leads you out, gets you over here, leads you on a dog and pony show. You come back, and what's happened? Your houses are burned down, your children are gone, your wives have been taken captive. And what they decided to do with David was this. They decided to stone that rascal. Now he's got some real problems. Before he only thought he had problems. Now David is up to his waist in the mud, right? His Jeep is stuck and he is stuck. No way out. So what was David's response? He slipped into the slough of depression and had a massive pity party. No one has ever suffered like I'm suffering. David was a Jew. They say things like that. But the good thing about David's pity parties, now I got to tell you about his pity parties. He threw a number of them, but here's the good thing about them. They never lasted very long. He suddenly recognized that he couldn't live in two worlds anymore. He couldn't live between two opinions. If the God he served was really God, then the time had come for David to act. And the Scripture says David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. Listen, when you're down on yourself and you're down on the world, here's what you do. You encourage yourself how? In the Lord. You start reminding yourself of some things. God is in charge of my life. I am no accident of history. God is leading, guiding, and directing me. And if I'm going through a bad time, it is to shape this vessel so that God can use it more effectively. Don't throw a pity party. I'll tell you about pity parties. Nobody cares. I'm always trying to throw them, and Chris looks at me and she says, I'm not impressed by that. But honey, I'm suffering here. Well, get over it. That's kind of what God said. God says, what's the matter with you? Oh, God, nobody ever suffered like us. Get over it. You know? Now, how did he demonstrate his encouraging himself? First thing he did is he called for his pastor. I love that, see? This is the right step. He calls for his pastor, the priest, Abiathar. And Abiathar gave him the guidance he needed in this waist-high mud hole he stuck in with his sheep. David asked him this question. He said, shall I pursue the Amalekites? Old Abiathar opened his mouth, and suddenly the voice of God erupted through it. He began in the spirit of prophecy, and he said this, pursue the Amalekites, for you shall surely overtake them. Now, these Amalekites, these desert raiders, had fled into the Negev, which is a huge place. I mean, it is a huge place, and it's very sparsely inhabited. But that didn't matter to David. God said, go get them, and you'll catch up with him. He had learned his lesson now, and so what does he do? He does as God says. Enough of this doubt and unbelief. God said it, that settles it, I'm going after them. He began to pursue the Amalekites. He didn't know where they were. That's the odd thing about this. He had no idea in this world where they were. He just took off. Chris says that's the way I do business a lot too. But then, you with me? But then, just by chance, are you watching my eye? You maybe can't see it, but I'm winking it. Just by chance, by some weird coincidence, they came upon an Egyptian who just happened to know exactly where the Amalekites were. Just a coincidence, right? He's just out there wandering around the desert, meets this Egyptian. He has to know where they are. Listen to me, folks. There are no coincidences when it comes to the things of God. Remember this. We are called to be Romans 8:28 believers. We are called to remember that all things work together for good to them that love the Lord and are the called according to his purposes. Was David called? Yes, he was. Was David anointed? Yes, he was. His steps are being directed by God. When God is on our side, beloved, we become a force. And the great thing about this force is that the one who fights on our side is greater than any enemy we might have. And when David found his enemies, they were all rowing drunk. Another coincidence. It's really good if you're going to attack a superior enemy and they're all falling down dead drunk. Your success is way along the way, right? So they were just celebrating the spoil they had taken in Ziklag. Well, David, he just waited. He just bided his time. And at midnight, at twilight, as the sun was going down, old David was using his best assets. He knew he was outnumbered. So what does he do? At twilight, David attacks. The battle continued all night long. Till the next day the sun came up, and then they fought all day long until the sun went down. And when it was ended, the victory was total. And this is what the Bible says in 1 Samuel chapter 30, verses 18 through 20. So David recovered. Hey, do you know that you've got an enemy that's stealing your stuff? See, what was it Jesus said about it? He comes to do what? He comes to steal, to kill, to steal, and to destroy. He steals our blessings from us. Now, if you get in his face and command him to do so, he's got to restore them 7 times. So David recovered all that the Amalekites had carried away, and David rescued his 2 wives. And nothing of theirs was lacking, neither small nor great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything which they had taken from them. David recovered it all. Then David took all the flocks, all the herds that they had driven before those other livestock, and said, "This is David's spoil." What's he got now? All of the Amalekites' stuff David now has. The enemy has given back to him that which he had taken. Well, thus David had avoided disaster as a result of his stinking thinking. But just barely. Don't give in to that. Don't chance it. Take control of your thoughts. You see, his refusal to believe that God would protect him had filled him with doubt and unbelief. But David was learning his lesson. He was discovering that it is always best for us to trust God. Psalm 118, 5 through 9 for me. I called on the Lord when I was up to my waist in the mud. The Lord answered me and set me in a broad place. That's a lot better than being in a mud hole. The Lord is on my side. I will not fear. What can man do to me? Is he learned his lesson? Yes. Has he said that stinking thinking doesn't work? Yes. The Lord is for me, among those who help me. Therefore, I shall see my desire on those who hate me. It is better to trust the Lord than to put confidence in man. Is that a wow? It is better to trust the Lord than to put confidence in princes. He had trusted Achish, but Achish wasn't the solution. The solution was God. And that, my friends, is my teaching for today.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to help spread the word, please give us a 5-star review and tell your friends to subscribe too. We are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Don't forget to connect with Ariel Ministries on Facebook and Instagram and subscribe to our email list at arielministries.com. That's Ariel spelled A-R-I-E-L. We look forward to keeping you updated on upcoming episodes and projects. If you would like to support the missional efforts of Ariel Ministries in Tharaka, Kenya with Each One Feed One, we'd like to remind you that 10% of all donations to Ariel Ministries will support this missional effort. Visit arielministries.com/give for online donations and other methods of giving. To learn more about the Tharaka mission, you can visit arielministries.com/missions. You can also listen to episode 26 for a deeper dive into how our relationship with Each One Feed One and the McCarter family started over 35 years ago, where we are today, and where we're headed in the future.